So over the last couple years, as I've been going back and revisiting a lot of material related to the Christian tradition and actually diving back into the Bible itself, there's been a real resurgence around the passages found in Genesis chapter 6, particularly related to the Nephilim. I've mentioned the Nephilim in many of my previous videos. If you've watched my Bible study videos, it was kind of a central tenet or a central theme in a way in which to sort of explain the overall narrative, the meta-narrative of what God is doing and how Christ's death and resurrection is actually a direct response to all three falls, but notably the second fall. I think that all that is correct, but where this gets, I think, confusing for a lot of people, including myself, as I've been trying to sort of wrestle with this, is that it's a very confounding passage in Genesis 6, and it also seems to be hard to reconcile with other ideas, central ideas, and even passages in the Bible. And so for that reason and others, this particular passage has become very controversial, and people have a lot of different opinions about it. So I have been working through it, and I do feel like there is maybe a good answer. It just may not be the answer that we typically think of. And that is what I'm here to attempt to try to break down and explain. I am obviously just sort of talking off the top of my head here, as always. I don't have any set outline or plan, but hopefully it goes smoothly and it makes sense. So I want to read a couple passages. Let me actually go to Genesis 6 first, and let's read that passage, since that's the primary one that we're going to be focusing on. And then I want to read another passage from the New Testament that often gets cited in relationship to this discussion. Okay, so this is Genesis 6. It's the start of the chapter, and it says this. When mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, My spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterwards. When the sons of God came to the daughters of men who bore children to them, they were the powerful men of old, the famous men, or in some passages, the heroes of renown. Okay? So, from the reading of this text, it would sound or seem that a couple things are taking place. Okay, so there's these sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, who are the same entities or beings that we associate with angels or demons. In this case, those entities were created the same, but the ones who disobeyed God and fell became known as demons, a term which is actually derivative of the Greek word demigod, daemon, and then of course we have angels, malach, which is a messenger. Okay, so the messengers are holy messengers who God sends to promote his work, and then of course the demigods or demons are fallen angels who are attempting to put themselves in the place of God as false gods, hence demigods. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. In this particular passage, we hear that these beings, these angels, essentially become attracted to human women and mate with them, okay, and even take them as their wives. And then these women produce offspring, and these offspring are known as the heroes of renown, okay? It also says this was in the days when the Nephilim were walking on the earth. And the Nephilim seem to be associated with giants, okay? They're described as being larger than the average man walking the earth. And they also seem to be, at least alluded to being, the result of this hybrid offspring between angels and humans, okay? And that's why there was this corruption. And then, of course, we know that this leads to God choosing to flood the earth And then, of course, that's the story of Noah. Okay, so just there's that. But where this gets, I guess, problematic and troubling is if we look at Matthew in the Gospel, in the New Testament, chapter 22, when Jesus is in the midst of his public ministry and he's confronted by the Sadducees, and they're trying to catch Jesus in some type of false doctrine, or just trip him up in some way, which is what both the Sadducees and Pharisees were often doing in these passages. And it says this. So it says, the same day the Sadducees came to him, this is Jesus, who say that there is no resurrection. And they ask him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So to the second and the third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. Okay? It's almost like a little riddle. They're trying to, like a theological riddle that they're trying to trick Jesus with. And here's Jesus' response. But Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, you have not read what was said to you by God. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teachings. Okay? Now, what's the point there? The point is that Jesus is clearly stating to the Sadducees that in the resurrections, or in the resurrected state, that even humans take on spirit form like the angels. And in heaven, there is no marriage, okay? There's no marriage between spirit beings. So where that creates a conflict is in how do we take that information and make it make sense with Genesis 6, where it says that these spirit beings did, in fact, take women as wives, and it seems to imply even produce offspring, okay? Well, there's a lot of different ways to interpret that. Historically, some people have just tried to reject the idea altogether that these fallen angels were in fact fallen angels at all, and tried to link them to other human societies and cultures in a different line, tracing it back through the genealogies and stuff like that. And that's a whole other thing, but I don't think it's accurate. I don't think that's a very good reading of the text, which is why so many people keep coming back to this and being like, no, it's got to be this. This is what it's saying. It's saying that they mated with these women and produced these offspring. So how do we reconcile that? Well, one of the most prominent thinkers on this particular subject matter in the recent decades has been a man by the name of Michael Heiser. He is an ancient language expert and PhD in that field. He's written many books on angels and demons and the unseen realm. I like Heiser's material. I think he does a lot of good stuff. Although I'm not exactly sure on this particular point if I fully agree with him. I'm still, like I said, sort of working through this. But what Heiser is very good about doing is 2 really important things. Firstly, he points out this, which is correct. He says, well, part of the problem is people are conflating or they're equivocating 2 different things. When Jesus speaks about resurrected bodies and angels, he says in heaven, which means they're not on earth. And so he's saying what that's telling us is there's no marriage in heaven. But in the case of Genesis 6, these beings are actually present on earth. And they seem to exist in some type of corporeal form. So Heiser concludes, perhaps what we can take from this is that while there's no marriage and or sexual intercourse in heaven, and whether you're an angel or a resurrected person, there is the ability to do that in the corporeal physical realm of earth. And this is an example of that. It's an interesting possibility, and it is true to the text itself, which is what Heiser's specialty is really breaking things down in the original ancient languages that these texts were written in. He also does a second thing that's really important, and I think that this is something that maybe some people don't know. Another really problematic or confounding aspect to this passage is it's a one-off. We only get this story one time. And it's just like a couple verses, and that's it. And we don't really have a lot of explanation. There's no backstory. We do hear about giants later in different books. Certainly we hear about Goliath. The Book of Amos, we hear about some of these different like Og and some of these other different characters who were described as being giants and are sort of linked back to either the Rephaim and Nephilim, which all seem to be this sort of line of these sort of hybrid giants and things like that. So there are allusions to this, and there's a lot of really smart people who've spent a lot of time really trying to break that down and elaborate on that. And you could kind of just go down that rabbit hole and probably never come out. But suffice it to say, one of the things I think that Heiser is really good at in this is sort of at least answering the first part of that question, which is, well, why is there so little said about this? Like, this seems like a pretty big deal. It's saying that, like, literally saying that, like, these sons of God, these spirit beings mated with human women and created these offspring. Like, shouldn't there be like a whole book on that? Well, there is, in some sense. If you know the Book of Enoch, which is non-canonical, okay, it's not a part of the Bible, and there's actually really good reasons it's not considered canonical. I did a whole video on that as well in my Bible study. I don't remember what lesson it was in that series. Unfortunately, it's probably like lesson 3 or 4, if I remember correctly. But there's other people out there who do a really good job of breaking down why the Book of Enoch is not in the original Bible and why it shouldn't be in the original Bible. And I would defer to someone like Wesley Huff, the biblical scholar, Canadian biblical scholar. He does a lot of videos about this as well, where he really breaks down why Enoch is problematic and why it should not be considered a canonical text. But either way, I think the reason why Enoch is so popular and has become popular again is because it does provide this really exciting and interesting and detailed backstory. Now, I don't think we should dismiss Enoch altogether. I think Enoch is still a valuable tool. I think it's a text that we can read, and it tells us how Jews living during Babylonian captivity in the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments interpreted this story, okay? And I think that does have value because there probably is truth to it in that sense, that this is the way that at least those people understood that story. But what Heiser points out that I think is good is that this particular story is actually not specific just to the Hebrew Bible, okay? So one of the things that's happened over the years with the development of archaeological research and retrieving of old texts and deciphering these texts and then doing this type of work, which is Heiser's specialty, is people have gone back and they've been able to do comparative analysis between various religions, comparative religions. I'll apologize in advance if my dog, he likes to get involved and he sometimes makes noise. So don't be distracted. Here he is. He wants to put his two cents in. Okay. So everyone has known for a very long time that there's multiple accounts of floods in other traditions. Okay. The most notable being the Mesopotamian flood stories. We find the epics of Gilgamesh and the story of Atrahasis. Is that his name? It's been a while. Either way, there's many different flood stories throughout antiquity. And the other interesting about it is for a period of time, they thought it was mostly located to the Mediterranean basin, but now we have them all over the globe, which does seem to signify a global flood, okay? And that matches the biblical story. And most people probably know that because it gave a certain authority to this idea of a global flood, even outside the biblical canon, which for some people, non-Christians, is relevant, okay? For a Christian, they probably didn't really care because, like, well, the Bible says it's true, so whatever. I don't really care what the other traditions say, but it is helpful to do comparative analysis. Well, what Heiser, I shouldn't say he alone, another scholar who was actually, I don't remember the guy's name, so I apologize, but if you get on Michael Heiser's webpage, you can actually find this article. If you just look up some of the key terms, it'll pop up. He talks about this also on some of his own YouTube videos, which you can go find if you do a little quick research. But essentially, there was a ancient language expert in Mesopotamian languages. So he basically was like Michael Heiser, but he was doing it he lived somewhere in the Middle East, and he was doing it specifically related to Mesopotamian literature, whereas Heiser's specialty was in the Hebrew language and the Christian tradition. But what he wondered, he said, well, this is the other scholar, was, the flood story we know is all over, it's ubiquitous, and that is an interesting story, but to him, the most interesting story was why the flood occurred in the first place, which was this passage in Genesis 6. So what he did is he started going back in the original literature, in the original, language, So these old Babylonian, Mesopotamian texts, and started to search to see if he could find similar stories. And sure enough, he did. And the story that he found is actually about a group of entities or beings known as the Apkallu. Okay, and the Apkallu were these demigod beings that were directly connected to the higher beings of Mesopotamian mythology. And they were basically sent down to sort of train and educate these humans and sort of advance them culturally by giving them sort of advanced knowledge and advanced technology. Now, interestingly, but not surprisingly, in this tradition, the way that the Apkallu are viewed is very positive. Like these beings are helping us, they're guiding us, and they're sort of like worthy of worship and service because they're giving this knowledge to people and advancing them. Whereas, of course, the key difference is when we get the biblical account, they're going, no, this is wrong, you're being led astray. And these entities, these B'nai Ha-Elohim, are actually fallen angels who are setting themselves up and disguised as demigods with really nefarious intent, okay? So the story's the same, but the interpretation is different, which is, again, not terribly surprising. That article is worth a read if you want to find it. Again, I apologize. I probably should have looked before I started filming. But if you get on Michael Heiser's page and just type in Apkallu, or Mesopotamian Apkallu, or just do a general web search, I'm sure this paper will come up because it has gotten quite a lot of press because of these findings. But the reason I tell you that whole backstory is to say this. When you're reading a text, or really anything, even if you're telling a story, we don't tell people or elaborate parts of the story that we understand the audience already knows, right? The parts we focus on is the new material that's relevant, okay? So if I was to give you an example, I could use like a sports analogy because why not? Imagine you're watching a American football game in the NFL, and your team that you like scores a goal right at the end of the game, and they do some weird trick play that was amazing, and you go to work the next day and you're talking to all your guy friends at lunch and you're like, hey, did you see that game last night? That was amazing. And then the guy's like, oh no, what happened? He's like, oh well, they were on the 5-yard line. There's only 2 minutes or only 20 seconds on the clock, because 2 minutes in football will last forever. 20 seconds on the clock. They were down by 5 points. They needed a touchdown to win. And so instead of hiking the ball to the quarterback, they hiked it to the halfback. And then the halfback threw a pass to the tight end in the end zone. And they won. Okay. So the point being in that analogy is the specific details I'm giving you is how the play was run, because that was what was unique. In American football, the ball's normally hiked to the quarterback, and the quarterback's the one who usually throws the football. In this case, it was hiked to the halfback, and the halfback was the one who ended up passing the ball. So it was a different spin on the play. Now, what I didn't explain to you was what a touchdown was, what a pass was, what a quarterback was, what a halfback was, what a tight end was, okay, so on and so forth, because the understanding would be everyone in the room knew those things already, okay? So similarly, when we go to this ancient story and we have this seemingly crazy story to our ears about these higher beings mating with humans and giving them advantages, and it's like, wait, what? Wait, give me more. That's it. We have to understand that it appears this was a common story throughout antiquity, and that it wasn't just something that Jews were aware of, all people were aware of, and that tracks if we put that in the context of all different pagan ideologies and pagan cultures throughout the globe, right? All of them have the same story, which is they're worshiping false gods, right? The Bible tells us, Paul tells us, he says it in I don't remember what book it is, but he says, all the gods of the pagans are demons, okay? And so this is a global thing that's happening, and it would be essentially the central ideology of these pagan religions. That's the foundation of it, is this, okay? So that at least answers why the Bible doesn't maybe go into this and elaborate on it, because for the people at the time it was being written, they didn't need any elaboration. It was being fed to them all the time. They were surrounded by it. What they needed is to understand how God viewed it differently than the rest of the cultures around them, and that no, these things weren't good, and no, this wasn't a thing to celebrate and worship, but in fact, this is the very thing that results in the second fall of humans, okay? The first fall being the Garden of Eden, the second fall here being in Genesis 6 with this mating between B'nai Ha-Elohim and the daughters of men, and then of course our third fall is the Tower of Babel, okay? Which we won't be talking about too much today. Okay, so that answers some of our questions, but there's still this problem about this idea of these beings mating with humans and how that works logistically, because even at the end of the day, when we can accept that when the spirit world comes into the physical world, we know that these spirits can take on physical form, and we have evidence of that in the Bible, right? There's multiple accounts of angels appearing to people. They appear before Abraham, they go into Sodom and Gomorrah, appear before Lot, so on and so forth, and they're described as being, men. They appear as men, and they even eat and drink. They take shelter. They sleep at night. So they seem to take on human-like characteristics when they're in the corporeal space. So, the next jump was, well, if they can eat and they can sleep and they can, take shelter like a normal human, and they can talk and they can appear as a human, maybe they can engage in sexual intercourse like humans. But that seems to be a stretch because of the fact that we know there's no marrying in heaven, but more importantly, just because a spirit can appear in various ways, right? We know this. In fact, even again, another example in the Bible where it says, even the devil appears as an angel of light, right? So we know that spirit beings can appear in different forms than what their actual form is. But that doesn't mean, on a very practical biological level, that they would have sperm or an egg. In fact, that would make no sense whatsoever, because if they weren't designed to marry and they weren't designed to procreate by God, they would have no need for sperm or egg. So how does that work logistically? And if you're a person like me, you're kind of just like, oh, this is weird. I don't get it. How do I make sense of this? Okay. I think there's actually a much better explanation. So I'm going to offer this. And this is an idea that I've come to grapple with, and I think it makes sense to me. So I'm throwing it out there, and maybe others will agree. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll come back with some criticisms and say, I've missed the mark entirely. But that's the great thing about having discussions about this. But I do think that this idea makes more sense to the text and all these ideas I've been discussing. But before I explain what it is, we have to actually look at the first fall. Okay? We need to go back to the garden. In the story of Genesis 2 and 3, when God creates Adam and then Eve, we get this story of where he puts these trees in the garden, right? The tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of everlasting life. Excuse me. Apologize. And they're told not to eat from these trees. Don't eat the fruit of the tree. And it says that, God tells Adam, if you eat of this tree, you will surely die, right? Okay. Well, along comes Eve. She's created, and the serpent in the garden targets Eve, and he basically says, eat from the tree. And she's like, well, we're not supposed to. And he's like, why not? And she says, well, because we'll die. He's like, no, you're not going to die. You won't. She's like, no. And he's like, no, he just doesn't want you to eat the tree, because then you'll know good and evil, and you'll have knowledge like God, and you'll be equal to God. Okay. So this is the great sin. Pride comes before the fall, right? That's the old saying. But there's this little nuance in there too about this idea of, well, no, you're not going to die. Well, sure enough, we know they eat the fruit, and we know what happens. But interestingly, perhaps, they don't die, right? Well, so was God lying? Was God wrong? How do you make sense of this? How do we reconcile the fact that God said, if you eat this fruit, you will surely die, and they don't physically die? They actually go on to live pretty long lives. They have multiple children, so on and so forth. Well, some would say, well, we do know that God says his spirit will not remain with man long, and therefore he limits their life on earth, but they still do live, okay? Part of the problem I think that we have now is we live in a very spiritually deprived time period, where because of the Enlightenment and because of this emphasis on scientific reductionism, right, where we tend to think that physical reality is all that is real. Even people who are believers and claim to believe in the spiritual reality sometimes don't think that way. And I'm guilty of that myself, because it doesn't come naturally to us. We tend to think of just being a physical space and physical reality. So we tend to interpret everything physically. And so we say, well, they didn't physically die. But anyone who's grown up in the church and has a sort of, at least somewhat foundational understanding of basic theology around this knows that the death is essentially, first and foremost, a spiritual death. Okay. And what that means is that spiritual tie, that direct tie we had to God through our access to him in the garden, that is severed. Okay, and we know that Adam and Eve could walk and talk with God in this sacred space. But after the fall, because of corruption, they're cast out of the garden. God puts a cherubim on the gates, and they can't get back in. And it's sort of like a firewall has been put up there, like a block. And now they don't have access to that spiritual connection to God that they once had. So essentially, it is a spiritual death. Now, it's still a death, and it still does carry over, and it does still affect them. And then eventually they do have physical death of their corporeal bodies, which comes later. But that is an interpretation that helps us to make sense of that. And I think if we put that same thought process in place and we actually apply it to Genesis 6, we will find that we can also come to some pretty clear and helpful understandings, okay? One of the things we know that happens, not only because of the literature that we find in the New Testaments and the Gospels, but also just throughout Christian history, is the idea of demonic possession, okay? And for anyone who's ever been involved in an occult religious practice or has studied at any length, knows that it's a lot going on with the interaction of us in the physical world with entities and beings in the spirit realm, okay? Now, because it's being done through occult practices like witchcraft and other forms of Satanism, it's being done illegally. So it's essentially a backdoor into the spirit realm, which is one of the things that essentially Satan is offering, right? He offers people, okay? And part of what that leads to is a lot of demonic involvement, okay? So whether it's infestation or oppression or even full-on possession, okay? If you also know the reason why people participate in these occult practices, it's because they in fact do work. They are able to connect and communicate with these demonic entities, and in so doing, those entities actually share information with them that empowers them, right? This is the point of doing witchcraft, right? The witchcraft, or witches, if you think of it historically, were what? They were women, okay, who colluded with and made pacts with what? Demons, fallen angels. And by making that pact with them, the demon would give them power that they could use over and against other humans. Well, what does this sound a lot like to you? The story in Genesis 6. These are the daughters of men, and they're taking on demons, and they're gaining power from this, and it actually translates and carries over into their children. Now, there's a couple things in there that a lot of people may not know if they're not familiar with various occult practices. But that is, in many of these occult traditions and pagan traditions, people, including women, would actually take on spirit spouses, where they would actually marry a demonic spirit, or what they believe to be a god. And obviously this marriage doesn't exist in the corporeal form in the same way that a marriage between a normal man and woman would exist, but it's a spiritual marriage, and it still includes soul ties, okay? So one of the things we know about when God talks about the creation of man and woman, and that when they come together, they become one, this creates soul ties, where their souls are tied. But that can also, it would appear, happen in the spirit realm too, where a physical person can collude with a spirit being and develop soul ties. And in the occult, there are many stories, and many people can account for these types of relationships, even so far as actually having sexual relations with demonic spirits, okay? So again, I know what you're wondering, like, Brad, how does that work? If we've talked about there's no sperm and there's no egg and stuff, well, again, first of all, the spirit realm is very symbolic, right? Most of the things you're doing in the spirit world, even when you talk about rituals and prayers, things like this, even incantations, whatever, it's largely symbolic, okay? And it's a symbolic action that has a point to it that's directing you to something else. In fact, even in the book or the Gospel of John, it would say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Well, God isn't actually literally a word, but what's it talking about? The word is a symbolic thing. It's an idea that has an association with it, okay? It's a signifier and a signified. It's pointing. And in the spirit world, that's a lot of times, that's why so much in the occult, they use symbols, right? That are very clear symbols, and it's all very symbolic. The point being, a spirit can take on corporeal form, we know. It can take on the guise of however it wants to appear. We know that there's several passages in the Bible where they appear as men, right, that look like normal men. We know that they can appear as other things because we know that the Bible says the devil will sometimes appear as an angel of light, which clearly he's not. So again, he can take on a different corporeal form than what we may assume. And then from there, they can just essentially simulate sex acts, okay? And the same way that people simulate sex all the time in all kinds of different ways, which I won't go into detail, but you probably get my drift, okay? But the point being is it's a significant act with very real consequences, right? That when people do, in fact, engage in this type of action through various occult rituals, they do form bonds with these demonic spirits. And this is essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about demonic possession, okay? What is a marriage between a man and a woman? Okay, it's a man and a woman who are giving each other access to their bodies in a way that is not open to everyone. And they're therefore forming a bond with them and developing a soul tie. Well, what is demonic possession if not a person allowing a spiritual entity to essentially take on their body and join in their body and also form a bond with them in the spirit world? It's essentially the spiritual form of this. It's a spirit marriage, okay? So it's not the same type of marriage that the Sadducees were talking about, because they're talking about a man and a woman being married and who the wife belongs to as sort of a possession or a spouse in the physical world. Not the case. This is something different. And I think if we put that in sort of this context, hopefully that makes sense. I think that Genesis 6 is really our first biblical account of demonic possession, okay? And that's what's actually happening here. These spirit beings found out, or maybe they always knew but just never opted to take advantage of this, that they could enter into these people in the spirit world. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that that original tie to God in the spirit realm in the garden was severed because of the first fall. So now, because there's the separation there, these fallen malevolent spirits can now move in and manipulate humans in order to take possession of them and essentially create bonds or marriages, spirit spouses in the physical world. Now, what does that mean in terms of their offspring? Because I know that's the question that everyone's going to ask. Well, but wait, these things clearly produced offspring. If there's no biological sperm, there's no biological egg, how does that actually work? Well, I think that can be explained too, with just a little basic anthropology, okay? What is one of the number one things or first things that anthropologists look to in order to determine the health and fitness of a society? You may not know the answer to that, but you can probably guess now. It's actually height. The height of the people living in that place, say first world country, second world, third world country, is a very clear indicator, of overall societal health, okay? In fact, there was a period of time in like the height of the Industrial Revolution, right? Like 1800s, when everyone's like working in factories and working in coal mines, where the heights of humans dramatically was reduced. And it was not uncommon for men to not grow over 5.5 feet tall, okay? Of course, now, healthier living conditions, people are more commonly 6 foot or taller, okay? So there's a ability to vary for variation, okay? Well, we know that these offspring are considered to be heroes of old, right? These are the people who end up ruling and running nations. Well, how come? Presumably, if we follow this train of thought, because their mothers colluded with demonic forces, and these demonic forces gave these women power, okay, which is real, okay, and there's examples of it in the Bible, okay? If you don't believe me, go read the story of Jezebel, okay, and the power she had over her husband Ahab, but also the fact that she sent Elijah into the woods terrified, okay? So these women can gain power, and they can use it for their own manipulation. And what that seemingly could have allowed them to do is to take their own power and their advantage and pass it on to their children. And that these might be children that are actually born into demonic contracts with demon spirits through this collusion, okay? This is also something that anyone who's been in the occult will tell you does in fact happen. And again, the reason for that would be that these children would have some type of advantage or power where they could manipulate the spirit realm and to their advantage. Well, if you take that back and place it into an ancient world, nomadic hunters and gatherers and things like this, and say that these are the people ruling nations, because they have this essential paranormal, right, or supernatural power they're getting from these demonic entities, they would set themselves up as the rulers of empires, which is essentially what it says happens. And then they would have a decided advantage over everyone else, including just in terms of access to food, right, shelter, quality of life, mates, all these types of things, which could unequivocally make them better suited for success, survival, and even probably taller, right? Maybe they're just bigger. To me, that idea makes sense, okay? Because it fits with all the ideas we find in the scriptures, and it also fits in alignment with what we know people in the occult actually do practice, okay? If you know anything about witchcraft, it's considered the old religion, right? The oldest religion. And perhaps this is another interesting point. Genesis 6, it seems to be the first example of witchcraft. And what it also seems to be is the first example of religion. Because prior to this point in time, there were no false gods. There were no other gods. There just was the one true God, and all people knew that. So there was no need for religions. But when these malevolent entities entered into this space and started possessing women, they took them on and then set themselves up as false gods, now you have alternative religious practices. And those alternative religious practices are going to be localized to wherever these demonic forces are interacting with humans. And this is essentially the birth of religion. And the first of it is witchcraft, which is women colluding with evil spirits, engaging in sex with them in the spirit realm, not in the physical realm, and utilizing that to gain power and also to produce offspring who have a decided advantage over others. So I think this is a much more robust and probably compatible interpretation of this. Although I don't know that it's going to trend with a lot of the sort of fringy paranormal trends out there, where people like this idea of like these beings that were bigger than us mated with us and created giants and all this kind of stuff, which gets you into some really interesting and weird folklore. Truthfully, I wasn't there, so I don't exactly know what happened. I just have to accept that there was this collusion between women and malevolent spirits, and it did result in sin, and it did result in God feeling compelled to flood the earth, which is a very serious matter. So take it as you will, but I think that is hopefully a helpful interpretation of this. And let me know what your thoughts are. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. I'd love to hear what you have to say. All right, have a great day.